Good afternoon, everybody. Good morning and good evening, depending on your time zone. I have the honor to introduce the third panel of this first day of the European Cyber Forum 2020, entitled Global Efforts to Counter Cybercrime, Leveraging Commonalities, Bridging Differences. Before introducing you to the distinguished panels for this session, let me just address a few housekeeping remarks. I encourage you to participate in the discussion via Mentimeter. You can type directly your questions following the link "Participate in the live Q&A" in the video, below the video in the EU Cyber Forum webpage, or you can connect to menti.com and use the number, the Menti code that you can see on the screen. Please write also your first name, your affiliation, and your country of origin. The session will be chaired by Nayia Barmpaliou, Head of Public Policy and Initiatives, Center for Cybersecurity at the World Economic Forum. But I would like, first of all, to thank you and to introduce Olivier Onidi, Deputy Director-General, DG Home Affairs of the European Commission. Thank you very much for being with us today. And with us in the panel, we also have Michael Daniel from the US, Albert Antwi-Boasiako from Ghana, and Alexander Seger from the Council of Europe. We also have with us Mara, our visual storyteller, who will visually draw the flow of the conversation, so we'll come back to her from time to time. Nayia, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Fabio, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening also from my side, and with quite an excited feeling to have such a star panel to discuss ongoing policy challenges, conundrum, and opportunities on cybercrime at the international arena. So I'll start by giving a bit more in-depth introduction to our panelists. First, joining us from Accra, Albert Antwi-Boasiako, who is the National Cybersecurity Advisor at the Ministry of Communication of Ghana. Thank you, Albert. Moving on to Arlington, Virginia, in the US, we have Michael Daniel, President of the Cyber Threat Alliance, a not-for-profit that brings together all the major cybersecurity companies to improve real-time, high-quality threat information sharing. As well as, of course, Olivier Onidi from the studio in Brussels, Deputy Director-General of Directorate-General Migration and Home Affairs of the European Commission. And finally, Alexander Seger, Head of the Cybercrime Division at the Council of Europe from the Bucharest office, who also, as he serves as well as head of the Cybercrime Capacity Building Office of the Council of Europe that is based in Bucharest. It is quite a lot to unpack. As we are on the first day of the EU Cyber Forum, and for those of you that have been following already the previous two sessions, the focus today is more on political and policy perspectives that touch upon the international dimension on cyber issues, and what we want to pick up in this conversation today, where we will have more operational discussions in the next days, on cybercrime cooperation. Today, we want to really focus on how the cybercrime landscape and outlook has been shaped up by the pandemic. Are we seeing any differences around that? And how does this then link with our capacity to cooperate internationally as we are seeing global processes at the UN continuing? We have the calls for a potential new convention on cybercrime currently starting to be discussed, and as well as other issues on regulatory operational silences linked to cybercrime. So without further ado, as well as inviting you to indeed submit your questions at Menti, because we really want to have quite an interactive discussion with substantial Q&A session later. I would like to kick it off with a very quick fire starter round to share the different perspectives on cybercrime landscape after the pandemic. And I would start with Michael, as the CTA has all the major global cybersecurity companies in its fold. You have an excellent picture of how cybercriminals have pivoted to exploit the pandemic. And it would be very interesting to get your insights on, especially as they relate to everyday users, as well as how this reality has impacted, if at all, the cybersecurity industry. Thank you, Michael.
Sure. So, I mean, what I would say is one of the things that's interesting is we have not seen new groups, we haven't seen new tools, or even really new tactics from very much a cybersecurity technical standpoint. It's actually mostly the same old stuff. What we have seen is that the criminal organizations have moved very quickly to capitalize on the pandemic in several different ways. They've changed lures, so for phishing lures, it's very much focused on COVID-19 related themes. They've set up fake domains, and they are now targeting users on their home networks. I would say that the effect on the cybersecurity industry is really two-pronged. If you're an enterprise CISO or somebody in charge of security at even a medium-sized business, your job got a lot harder overnight because an enormous amount of your workforce suddenly went remote. And we are still recovering from that essentially unplanned shift to a vast proportion of the workforce working remotely. And cybersecurity providers are finding that many customers who are kind of meh on cybersecurity before now suddenly see it as vital. And so actually many cybersecurity companies are, finding themselves actually in some ways shorthanded because they've actually got more work than they had before.
This is excellent, and it helps us also to maybe pivot how that reality, Olivier, as the pandemic in general has caught up the international community as well by surprise, not only necessarily, industry and enterprise CISOs and the like. Has it actually forced the EU to adapt its policy-making perspective on, specifically on cybercrime? And you can also give us a bit more of a larger perspective, but specifically on cybercrime, has this been an impulse to rethink some of our assumptions?
Thank you, Nayia. Like Michael, I think we've seen indeed that nothing was dramatically new, but definitely everything was exacerbated by the fear of individuals facing the pandemic. The fact that they've been more vulnerable as well to some of the old tactics of trying to sell them like fake medicine, things like this. But also they've been psychologically more vulnerable. And this is also one of the reasons why we've seen such a surge of disinformation and a lot of campaigns actually targeting at influencing individuals and usually influencing individuals in trying to radicalize their behavior, exacerbating movements to try to spread violence in denying the reality of COVID or in all sorts of different aspects. This we've studied very, very closely in our work on counterterrorism with all the work we're doing on radicalization. So in essence, for the EU, probably the lessons we've learned from that was that it was the perfect ground in order to make even a more telling and pressing case as to the importance not only to work on the resilience, and I think this conference has again shown how we've developed our capacity to act in terms of protecting the environment, protecting also the networks, protecting the individuals, but also equally, and this is somewhat new, trying to accelerate the provision for the law enforcement community and the judicial community at large with better tools, with better possibility to actually respond to crimes being conducted in the cyberspace. So I would say that has been a very, very strong motus of our action, and many of the initiatives that we are working on currently is actually geared at providing the law enforcement the right, so the legal certainty to act, but also equally to provide the private companies this necessary partner that the law enforcement needs with the similar legal certainty in order to be able to cooperate, to be able to analyze, to identify and to exchange information with the law enforcement community. The other very, very important element, and I'm sorry if I'm a bit long into this, the other important element is also the fact that it was an additional recognition of the fact that we needed to step up our activities to develop, to deploy new technology tools. Why? Because cybercrime necessitates a whole set of different tools, technological tools, in order to be able to identify criminal activities and also act on those activities. So on these two grounds, I think the COVID times has been extremely helpful in order to accelerate the work. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivier. And I think you said two words that will be our keyword as we move ahead in the session on the legal certainty. So I'll keep that as an aide-memoire. And indeed, exactly what you described. Also, we see in the new cybersecurity, in the new security union strategy that the EU recently published. So on that note, allow me to get a bit of a perspective from Ghana. And indeed, if we haven't seen something new, but more of the same, but much more accelerated, is this the same picture that Albert, you can share with us from the trends that you are seeing in Ghana?
Thank you, Nayia, once again for moderating this, and to my colleague panelists. But I want to also say a big thank you to the European Commission for making this possible, even COVID-19. And I think it's exciting being part of this conversation also this year. I think I'm not going to say anything different from what the previous speakers have said, but I want us to put things in perspective. And I want to, look at the current trend of COVID, cybercrime in the era of COVID-19 from very different perspectives. I call them factors. So we have the incremental factor, we have the variation factor, but we also have the novel factor. In other words, we can assess cybercrime development at this material point in time, in this particular instance, from these three particular perspectives. And permit me to share some examples when I mention about incremental factor. For example, the government of Ghana has launched a point of contact for incident reporting. And we've seen that from March till this time, we've had a number of cases coming in. In other words, it means that there are a lot of activities going on as far as cybercrime offending is concerned. And that is what constitutes the incremental factor as far as COVID-19 and cybercrime issues are concerned. But there's also the variation factor. Absolutely. My colleagues have mentioned about phishing trends, and we have COVID-19 related teams exploiting the current situation, whether in the health sector, in the business, in the banking sector, because when there was lockdown, everybody here was doing internet banking or mobile money transaction. And certainly we had a number of scams that were being perpetrated around some of these platforms. And that is a variation factor. It was hard to debate here, but I want to attempt to look at what also is seen as a novel factor. And I will share an example here. The government of Ghana has introduced a number of initiatives since COVID-19 got to us here. One of them is a support for businesses, small businesses. And we've seen a new development where cyber criminal groups are setting up fictitious website, pretending and forging relevant information that requires the public to make a request for some funding support. This is typically a kind of trend that has arisen because of COVID-19. In other words, that particular fraud wouldn't have happened. It wouldn't have come up without actually COVID-19 and the resulting action by government. So these are the particular perspectives that we have witnessed within this particular space. And I think they are not different from what my colleagues have already shared. But it was good to look at it from this broad perspective. Nayia, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Albert. And I think you really captured it very, very interestingly from these three different dimensions. And that brings us to more of also the global perspective. Alexander, in your work, you're engaging daily with countries globally, be it for your capacity building activities that you're leading globally, but also on legislation support and the like. What is the one thing that you have heard most from your partners at Ministries of Justice, prosecutors, police in these last 6 months in terms of the high methods and the common thread?
Thanks, Nayia. Good to be with you and everyone else on this panel. What we hear is what the other panelists have also heard so far, namely we have more of the same in many ways. So the scale has changed. There's some acceleration of cybercrime, and there are, of course, also variations, as Albert has pointed out. So we have more phishing, more ransomware, more attacks against critical infrastructure, more fraud, more misinformation. What I'm concerned is I'm coming back to what Olivier said. Yes, resilience, there are measures taken, but do we have an effective criminal justice response? Do we have an increase in the number of investigations, prosecutions, and adjudications? And there I have some doubts. What we hear is that the capacities of law enforcement are stretched, that they are stepping out fires. There is maybe notice and takedown of fraudulent sites, but I'm not sure about the real increase in investigations and prosecutions. We need to underline that measures to increase resilience need to be accompanied by an effective criminal justice response to investigate and prosecute offenders that exploit the COVID-19 pandemic. And here we have, as we all know, the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime as a framework for international cooperation with currently 65 parties. The challenges are limited capacities. And there's another challenge, namely the need for urgent cooperation. Law enforcement need to identify the owners of accounts, of domain names. In other words, they need subscriber information and domain name registration data. And this is what we need to work on. How can we ensure that law enforcement can get such data from providers, from registrars, if possible, through direct cooperation with such entities in other territories. So this is what we are currently working on. We're working on a new protocol to the Budapest Convention that will permit cooperation in emergency situations, that will permit direct cooperation with service providers and other parties to obtain subscriber information. It will permit requests to any disclosure of who is information. Now, that protocol will probably only be available in about 1 year from now. And hopefully by that time, the COVID pandemic is over, or at least contained. If not, the tools of the protocols will be available. But we also need to be realistic. COVID-19 will not be the last pandemic. And the next one may be digital. So we need to be better prepared for the next pandemic, whatever form it takes. Back to Nayia.
Thank you, Alexander. And I think I would say keywords again here is the need for an effective criminal justice response. And even if we are trying to address challenges like this, it seems that some of the back to basics are important, because we see that not everyone in every country in the world or every law enforcement in the world is able to deal with this alone, and it shouldn't. And actually that brings me to the legal certainty piece that Olivier also highlighted before, and maybe really much more closely to the topic of our panel, which is on the positive side, I would say, leveraging commonalities. And as we're seeing existing policy and legal instruments are fit for purpose to address this new scalability and new kind of overwhelming omnipresence of the attack surface, as we are seeing vulnerabilities really increasing. So on the one hand, the focus on resilience is very good, but do we actually have the right tools for an effective criminal justice response? And I think, Olivier, you alluded to it, but about the capacity building efforts for law enforcement, even a step before that, in order to be able to cooperate, we need that legal certainty. Do we have the legal and policy instruments that are fit for purpose when any investigation right now necessitates cross-border requests for access to electronic evidence, the direct cooperation that Alexander spoke about? Can you give us your perspective from the European Commission?
I think, we certainly don't have all the tools or the tools at the magnitude we need in order to be as effective as we should be, given the surge of crime on the cyberspace. The good thing, though, is that we know what is needed. So there is at least a very strong focus on what we effectively have to develop in order for both investigation, but also then prosecution to be effectively conducted. You've highlighted the aspect of legal certainty. It's a very important one because in many of these fields we are in apparent and sometimes conflicting situations with other legal norms, like notably all the body of legal norms that have been developed worldwide, I would say, in order to protect fundamental rights, privacy of individuals. So we need to make this compatible. And give you a very recent example. The private sector is ready to cooperate, but the private sector rightfully tells us that in a number of cases, they are either facing conflicts of jurisdiction, since those actors are operating cross-border, or they are actually facing conflicts of law within the same jurisdiction. So last week, for example, with the coming into effect of the the new e-privacy framework in December that would cover all means of communication, we had to present a very quick fix in order to provide actors of the internet with the same capacity as today in order to detect and trace child sexual abuse on the internet. So you see that even on those type of horrible crimes, we constantly need to adapt our legal framework because we do have conflict, and this is not like in international cooperation activities. It's within a jurisdiction, the EU, which is fairly homogenized already. So that's the first, I think, first important element. Second, second element is that in order to fight crime, is it cyber or not, most of the data, most of the evidence, most of the important information that you need is of electronic form. And most of this, 85%, is actually saved on a server somewhere outside of your jurisdiction. So here as well, starting with the EU, we had to propose a new framework that will dramatically speed up the access to electronic evidence within the EU. And this is the reason why we are so supportive to multilateral initiatives, and notably starting with the Council of Europe initiative, in order to beef up the Budapest Convention with a new protocol allowing similar expedited ways for law enforcement in the framework of an authority and an authorization that is provided by a judge, of course, a very strict supervision on this side, to get quick access to electronic evidence that is stored wherever it is based, and starting with the EU, like-minded countries which are the most active in the Council of Europe, including countries like Ghana, for example, and then hopefully enlarging this family of countries, since of course we are talking about sensitive data in the context of sensitive also procedures, so there needs to be a body of safeguards, common safeguards or commonly accepted safeguards that help us out on this. Another good example, I would say, is the fact that not only do you need access to the information, but once you have access to the information, you need to be able to read that information. And here again, we're faced with something that might look as a conflict, but that it isn't actually. There is a quest to constantly improve the ways to protect private communication or corporate communication, etc., with a surge of services that are using encryption and more even end-to-end encryption, and a very difficult technical but also legal capacity for law enforcement, etc., to actually access this and read this information. So here as well, we've embarked into a groundwork with the private actors to better understand what could be feasible in order to ensure that we do have, whatever the sophistication and the degree of protection of encryption, we have the capacity actually to read what is being encrypted. And Europol was very recently in a massive investigation, cracking actually in a private network that was used by organized crime worldwide with the help of the US, many European member states, a private tool, EncroChat, that had been developed specifically to help encrypt and have private conversation between organized crime groups. And it is with the help of the technology, but the help also of the legal framework amongst those states that have cooperated, that Europol was able to crack into this communication and bring now a lot of evidence to the courts in order to dismantle those crime groups.
Thank you, Olivier, and great pleasure to see you didn't shy away from the elephant of the privacy. And as we have experienced in the EU externally, there is certainly a perception that the privacy concerns have somewhat have a primacy over the criminal justice response, which is, as you clarified, not so much, not really the case. And I would not even call it a conflict, but an effort for reconciling the different interests. And having been a criminal justice lawyer myself, I do sometimes wonder if it would be a very educational, let's say, exercise if we would all go to the court and see what actually are the standards of evidence and the like, in order to actually be able to have also effective criminal justice in that end. And that brings me, picking up on the evidence directive, that brings me more to also how that links to the work that the Council of Europe is doing with the Budapest Convention, Alexander, and this new efforts in the last couple of years to be able to work precisely in this direct cooperation and the discussions around an additional protocol. And if you could give us a bit more insights on how are the technological innovations impacting a convention that was drafted 20 years ago?
Thank you. Before I comment on that, I would like to take up a point that Olivier also made and elaborate a bit further on that, or what you also made, Nayia, about the privacy versus security and that sort of things. Most cybercrime, a large amount of cybercrime interferes with privacy rights. We have to be clear of that. So cybercrime interferes with the privacy of individuals. So it's not an issue of fighting cybercrime or having privacy. I think through fighting cybercrime in the right way, you protect the privacy, you ensure the rights of individuals. That's a very important point. Secondly, a very small share of cybercrime actually leads to convictions. The share is so small, it has several zeros behind the comma before you even get to one. So this we have to also realize. So we have to also realize that governments have the obligation to protect individuals against crime. And if they cannot do it through criminal justice, then national security institutions will take care of that. And more will shift from criminal justice to national security bodies with lesser thresholds and with more limited safeguards for the rights of individuals. We have to be very clear of that. Now, what we are doing currently, let's step back. 20 years ago, almost 20 years ago, in November 2001, the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime was opened for signature. And still today, it's the most relevant international treaty in this field. Why is that? It's because the type of offenses foreseen in the treaty, alone or in combination, address still today most types of cybercrime. That also relates to COVID-19 related cybercrime. Secondly, the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime provides for procedural powers to secure electronic evidence with safeguards, with rule of law safeguards. And not only in relation to cybercrime, but electronic evidence in relation to any criminal offense. Therefore, a very broad scope of application. That's why it's very attractive. Finally, it also provides for international cooperation, not only on cybercrime, but any crime involving electronic evidence. And all of this is backed up by capacity building measures, by a package of capacity building here now done by the Cybercrime Programme Office of the Council of Europe in Bucharest, where we are running programs with a volume of about 40 million euros, a lot of it coming from the European Union, but also from United States, from United Kingdom, Estonia, Japan, and other partners that are contributing to this. And the Budapest Convention is up to date every day, every week. Colleagues here in my office in Bucharest are assisting states around the world to adopt their legislation, to strengthen their capacities, criminal justice capacities based on the norms of the Budapest Convention. But all of this, obviously, is not enough. So what happened, what we did, or what the parties to the Budapest Convention did, was after years of analysis of evidence in the cloud computing issues, and so on, 3 years ago, in September 2017, work on a new protocol was launched. A second additional protocol to the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime that will provide for more effective mutual legal assistance, because let's face it, mutual legal assistance, many people complain about it, it's too slow, but it's still and will remain the most important means to obtain evidence from another state. We have to make it more efficient. So provisions to that effect will be foreseen in this protocol. But secondly, we have to figure out how to deal with emergency situations. So what this protocol is likely to contain is provisions for emergency mutual assistance to make sure that you can also get a response to your MLA request on the weekend. Secondly, another form of expedited disclosure of data that is currently being discussed. So these are some of the needs, but then we have to go further than that. And one of the provisions, the draft has been published some time ago, is to permit direct cooperation with the service provider in another party. It means to obtain subscriber information without having to go through the authority of that other party. That requires, of course, safeguards. I will come back to that, the safeguards that Olivier referred to. And finally, we have another issue, namely that it's also apparent in the relation with COVID-19 that many of these fraudulent websites, you need to identify who is the owner of this website, who registered a website. And now, what in the past was public, who is information on domain name registrants is in many cases not public anymore. So you have to go to the registrar in another state to obtain this information. And we want to include in this new protocol a legal basis for requests to registrars, but also for the disclosure of registrant information to a requesting party. So this is a type of the type of tools we want to provide for in this new protocol. As I mentioned earlier, we hope that in a year from now, that protocol is available and open for signature. One of the difficult tasks we have to do is we have to make sure that these tools are efficient, but at the same time also are compatible with rule of law safeguards and data protection requirements. It's a very difficult task, but I'm sure if all those around the table remain constructive, we will achieve this. Back to you, Nayia.
Thank you, Alexander. And I think this is a really interesting update, both on the second protocol questions and process, but most notably, I think, we cannot hammer enough the points that you made about cybercrime interfering with the privacy of individuals. That is a narrative that we haven't really seen also pushed forward from the criminal justice community, and it's quite an important point to highlight that. And of course, the shift from a criminal justice process to more national security processes is certainly, from historically at least, let's say, we hasn't led to very good examples of more privacy and more freedom, rather the opposite. That moves me to Albert, and we have quite a lot in the next 15 minutes to unpack. So Albert, maybe quickly, your experience with working as a state party to the Budapest Convention you ratified in 2018. Has it practically changed anything in terms of your national posture, and why do you think more African countries are not, requesting to accede? Is it more of a capacity issue? Is it more of a legal issue? Please give us your feedback.
All right, thank you. And I think African countries are coming up strongly. When I look at the data in terms of how these countries are opening up to the Council of Europe relative to the convention. But let me touch on an important subject matter here, Nayia. I've been in this role for the past 3.5 years, and there hasn't been any international cooperation arrangement that has delivered measurable results to Ghana compared to Ghana's accession to the Budapest Convention. And specifically, we can trace this in the area of capacity building. And I've also been practicing the private sector before serving in the current government. And when I look back the past 5 years, what the Budapest Convention has delivered to Ghana through the Glazy Plus project, I think that is quite commendable. One particular area, Ghana has got Electronic Transaction Act, which was passed in 2008. The act addresses criminalization of cyber offenses, and fairly about 90+% of cybercrime cases are addressed in that particular legislation. Until Ghana approached the Council of Europe relative to the Budapest Convention, knowledge even about the legislation was very limited. And whenever people speak about lack of legislation, I always try to point something out to them. There's one issue having the legislation, but there's another issue also understanding and operationalizing the legislation. And I think the latter is what's really the Glazy Plus project. Matteo and his team has been able to really leave a lasting legacy as far as Ghana's response to cybercrime is concerned. And the criminal justice sector has really benefited from this particular area. But there is also a dimension of legislation review to ensure harmonization international cooperation also requires harmonization of our laws, both in criminalization and but also procedural matters to address the issue. And of course, Council of Europe brings best practice to help enforce this. It's not a question of whether I need it or not. The whole thing is cyber is a global commodity that is subject to the same laws of demand and supply. So whether you are a wealthy country, or a developing country, a poor country, there ought to be a certain harmonized framework by which we can then cooperate. And I think Council of Europe has really led that effort, and Ghana has benefited because we have really signed up to the convention. Let me touch a bit on why possibly African countries, most of them have not signed up yet, even though we have the numbers. When I take the countries in my region, Nigeria is in the process, Burkina is in touch, and other countries, the Gambia, we made some effort there. And these are some of the positive development in that area. But really, political commitment has been a major determinant by which we can move government around the continent towards this direction. But it's not just, political commitment should be viewed in relation to other issues. And I keep on pointing out awareness creation among the political class in appreciating the need for Budapest Convention in their respective jurisdictions, okay? But there's also a need, and I think the Council of Europe has really recognized that you need champions in those African countries to do so. Champions at a ministerial level. And I think Ghana is fortunate to have a minister responsible for cyber matters who has really championed this through cabinet and through parliament as well. So I think we need to emphasize that, well, we need to identify these champions who really understand the issues and who can sell these issues to their government. But at the same time, you also need champions at the technical level. And I believe these are some of the angles we should be looking at it. Alex mentioned about the incremental factor of cyber. We have several issues. Most of the cases that were reported to a point of contact, more than 70% of cases, cases with criminal elements. How do we get the law enforcement in these African countries to respond to those issues? I believe the Budapest Convention route provide capacity building, but also international cooperation arrangement. But I think we need to package it and get political commitment moved in these countries to ensure we have a lot more numbers sign up to the convention. Nayia, thank you.
Thank you, Albert. And I think, that also links to, capacity building either at that very high decision maker level that we need in terms of awareness. Quickly, Michael, to you, as you're working with global corporates, is this discussion over a Budapest Convention or a new UN Convention on cybercrime pertinent for industry at all? I mean, we heard a lot about the need to work with the private sector. Are there any perspectives, let's say, that this framework actually influences or has a positive or negative impact?
Well, I think the truth is that it is pertinent to the private sector. It's just that most of them don't know it. I think unless you're a former government person like me, if you ask most people in the private sector, what's the Budapest Convention, they might tell you, did that have something to do with World War II? There probably isn't a lot of awareness of the utility that it has. But it is really important because, as we've been discussing, crime today, not just cybercrime, but all crime is not only remote, right? It's no longer local, it's remote, but it's also distributed. So you now have a situation where you could have the victim of a crime in one country, the perpetrator in a second, and the evidence in actually countries 3 and 4. So therefore, it becomes even more important to have as much consistency in the rules for cross-border data flows, for managing digital evidence, for data preservation requests as possible. And when you're doing research, into cybercrime, it's hard to know where you are. like where have you landed on that server, or things like that. So again, having that structure, is really, really important. And the last point I'll just make, building on something that Alexander was saying, in my view, in a digital world, right, you cannot have good privacy if you don't have good cybersecurity. But I'll add a third factor into there, which is that as we have digitized more and more of our services, as we have digitized things like our power grid and our healthcare system and the water systems, you now also cannot have good public health and safety unless you have good cybersecurity. So you actually have security, safety, and privacy all in a triangle, all actually dependent on each other. And so that makes things, and those things are dependent on each other across borders. Even for a country as large as the United States, our power grid, for example, is shared with Canada. So in many ways, all three of those things, privacy, security, and safety, are dependent on good international law foundations of things like the Budapest Convention.
Excellent point to drill down, Michael, sorry, because of the safety piece that until now hasn't really been brought back, because we had more of the hard criminal justice, let's say, perspective. I want to give a couple of minutes to each of you to focus a bit on the differences piece that is in the title of our panel before we move on to a few questions that have come in. And that links very much indeed to what was alluded also in the video on the call for a new UN Convention on Cybercrime versus versus or complementary to the Budapest Convention. You might take it as you like. So maybe 2 minutes from each. I wanted to start with Olivier on, the European Union has not been in favor of this. At least in the UN General Assembly that approved the resolution to start this process of negotiations over a new international treaty against cybercrime. Can you give us your thoughts around that? Wouldn't be a global UN treaty, wouldn't be a good solution at this stage?
It would be a fantastic and much needed solution in the long term, but given the difficulty of the task, we thought we needed to be pragmatic at this stage. So nothing we do will disincentivize the UN to continue looking at these matters and preparing the ground for ultimately a solution that would encompass as many members of the UN as possible. But given the degree of difficulty, given also the urgency to come to at least the first nucleus of a multilateral solution, we thought that the Budapest Convention should be not only the anchor, but also really the prime target we should look at this particular moment. And we believe that if we make it happen in the context of the Council of Europe, we will have a very, very strong base to show how to reconcile fundamental rights, very important principles, lying on the foundations of our democracies, and some of the tools and avenues in order to fight crime and hence get more direct access to information within our jurisdiction. So we continue participating in the discussions in the context of the UN, but our priority and all our forces these days are really in hopefully finalizing at least the essence of what an agreement could be in the context of the Council of Europe by the end of the year.
Thank you, Olivier. And maybe Albert, to you, as you actually gave us quite a comprehensive overview of the activities Ghana has implemented since ratifying the Budapest Convention. What is the perspective from Africa? Is there a sense that there is a new need for a new convention, or how could African countries be mobilized to have a more potentially well-informed position around this.
All right, Nayia, thank you once again. My government, the government of Ghana, believes in fasting. And I believe that is the same perspective in most of the African countries. First things first means that what does Africa need at this point in time? Africa needs capacity building. We need to protect our critical information infrastructure. We need to build capacity for the criminal justice sector. We need forensic capabilities for law enforcement. We need to get big tech firms to comply, to engage, and help African countries to address issues of internet or fake news or whichever we call that. And the election is coming in Ghana in December, and we have a lot of some of those things. So really, if we are looking at the needs basket, I will place capacity building first. Convention also means capacity, because I was talking here about the need, cyber being a global commodity that has certain implications. That means you need to have certain international, legally binding international cooperation arrangement. But really, let's look at Budapest Convention. I think once again, from Ghana's perspective, in terms of the needs basket, these issues are being addressed. Once we get a lot more people getting on board, we should be able to address this. So if we're looking at the science alone and not the politics, the science as to really the science to respond to the needs of the African countries at this point in time in addressing cybercrime issues, I think there is some sort of work, a framework that nations can work around to make sure that we address our immediate needs and look at it forward. Because I am concerned, and you rightly mentioned maybe the lack of awareness. How many years is it going to take for the world to negotiate a new convention that will become operational? Especially when international cooperation matters, very difficult to take the politics out of the science. Nayia, I think I rest my case here. Thank you.
Thank you, Albert, for quite also an impassioned feedback. I'll move to Alexander. As I see, we are indeed running out of time. As the Council of Europe has been at the forefront of global capacity building efforts, and I think the message from Albert was clear, and many other countries, not only on the capacity on the ground with those that have acceded or have requested support, but also being used as a framework and a blueprint for countries that might not be interested in necessarily ratifying, but using it as an example. However, we see that in several countries in the global south, this doesn't really translate to the votes at the UN fora, and possibly, I think maybe Albert has already captured this, that you cannot take politics out of science, but it would be interesting to see to share with us if there is a missing link, if the community, in the international community, would need a bit more awareness raising on the facts and not on more, let's say, politics or ideology around legal basis.
Thank you. And once again, I fully agree with what Albert has said. The primary needs of criminal justice practitioners around the world is capacity building. And this is what we hear. I used to work in the United Nations over 30 years ago, and there was a move to start discussions about the Cybercrime Treaty in 1990 at the UN Crime Congress. It did not find a consensus. And the problem is, during those past 30 years, no consensus has been found on that. There seems to be some sort of an ideological divide today. Namely, you have on the one hand states that believe that information is the problem and that information crime is the problem, and therefore governments should control what information individuals can receive, share, disseminate. This is one view, and the other view is that of a free and open internet, where data can flow freely and people can freely share information, but where restrictions apply only if there's criminal misuse. So you have narrowly defined restrictions criminalizing certain conduct that is then investigated and prosecuted. And I believe that the lack of consensus during the past 30 years is over this fundamental ideological divide. We also have to realize that the General Assembly resolution of the UN in December last year, December 2019, was not adopted by consensus. The divide was also there. 79 states, I believe, voted in favor of going for a new treaty. 60 said no, and 54 abstained. So again, no consensus. And this is where the whole risk comes about. Yes, the United Nations should have developed a treaty on cybercrime many years ago, but not if that leads to further fragmentation, to further international divisions. And that is the risk that we have right now. So it's very important that any future treaty should be negotiated by consensus. It should be negotiated by criminal justice experts, and those usually in the United Nations meet in Vienna and not in New York, where other policy considerations interfere. And any future international agreement should be consistent with what has already been achieved, namely consistent with the Budapest Convention, consistent with the laws of those more than 100 countries that already have put their domestic legislation on the Budapest Convention. The key problem, and you talked about this missing link in a way between practitioners and the actual decision making when it comes to new treaties. Criminal justice practitioners in many countries are not involved in decisions making. Decisions for or against a new treaty are often made by ministries of foreign affairs, and for them all sorts of other policy considerations come into the picture. It's not just based on the needs of an effective criminal justice response. So indeed, more awareness needs to be created. Decision makers, foreign policy decision makers, need to be aware of what criminal justice practitioners need and want. Back to you, Nayia.
Thank you, Alexander. And I'll pick up on the ideological divide and maybe move to Michael for a final question to him before we abuse a bit of all of your time to take 4 questions that have come in. Michael, moving from the ideological divide to the public-private cooperation divide, do you see openings for improvement in that current architecture to address cybercrime? And what do you see in your daily work and with the cybersecurity companies, but also the national law enforcement?
Sure, and I think I would identify really 4 places that we need to make some improvements. One is actually just in effects, right? That typically law enforcement focuses very much on arrest and prosecution. And that's a very useful tool, but in many cases, we're not going to ever be able to physically get to many of the perpetrators behind cybercrime. So we need to broaden our aperture and look at other ways of imposing costs on those cyber criminals besides just arrest and prosecution. In addition to that, we also want to increase the speed, right? And have these effects imposed in weeks or months, not over years. As Alexander was saying, the impact on cybercrime has a lot of zeros before you get to a 1. And so we want that to start happening more rapidly. We want to increase the scope so that it's, across a lot of different countries, so that it's not just protecting, say, Western Europe or the United States, but globally. And we want to have that at scale. We actually want to have a measurable impact on cybercrime across the world, not just nibble at the edges.
I think that captures very well, and without being called as a seamless flag, I would like to flag that this is indeed a challenge. We are working at the World Economic Forum with many of you around this virtual roundtable, and would invite anyone interested to look up on our website. I'll just ask if we have a minute to look at the lovely graphs that the colleagues in Brussels have been preparing as we are moving on to some of the Q&A, and I think this is quite interesting to capture some of our the key points that we've made, and capture. I think capacity building is a theme that has come up repeatedly. The reconciling privacy and security, and how do we move past ideological divides in the international fora. Let me read a few questions that have come in, and I think I'll start with the one that I would say, it's definitely for Olivier. Will the Privacy Shield judgment impact the EU cooperation on cybercrime with the United States and other countries in the future? Does this gonna change anything? I'm gonna pick up a few others so that we group them, and I'll be keen to hear your feedback holistically. On if the COVID-19 restrictions on travel, how do they actually have an impact on securing custody over cybercriminals, especially when their home countries provide safe haven and won't cooperate? And I would imagine this is more broadly an issue, not only related to the COVID specifications. Cybercrime is difficult to attribute. How do you deal with this when resolving the origin of a crime? And then I would say two more points on IoT devices that they're not secure by design and becoming entry points for cyber attacks. What are we doing to counter this? And final point, I would say, in terms of moves us more to the disinformation piece. Sharing information on political crimes is difficult. With the prevalence of misinformation and disinformation, more topics are becoming political. How can we overcome this obstacle now globally? So I'll open it to you for feedback, and maybe we can start with Olivier, especially as it relates maybe to the Privacy Shield more, but please feel free to jump in. We have 8 more minutes, so would be keen to hear your thoughts.
Thank you. Now, on the first, I think the very important message we've heard all along is that any activity to crack down on cybercrime goes through international cooperation, international partnership. I mean, there are very, very few cases where you actually act locally, and hence the very, very strong focus on facilitating the means of cooperation with different partners worldwide. I think Albert said it, Michael as well. They are hiding everywhere. So it is a truly global dimension. In this, one of the absolute fundamental aspect that is needed is the capacity to exchange information. And in that respect, we have the dimension of exchanging information amongst private entities, and that's the center of the debate on the Privacy Shield, the information exchange between private entities over the Atlantic. But equally, you have the capacity to exchange information between law enforcement and the judiciary with private corporation. An example, we are currently reviewing the legal base of Europol in order to provide Europol, our body that is meant to facilitate the cooperation within the European Union, to actually exchange information freely, I mean, with safeguards, of course, but exchange information with private actors. Because for financial transactions, for anything today, you need the help of private actors. Not only the internet companies, but all private actors that are at one point in time a facilitator, a victim, or a target of a crime. Then you need the capacity for the law enforcement to exchange information with third countries, with third country jurisdiction. And here as well, we've seen over the years a lot of the focus on protecting the privacy, protecting data of individuals for very good reasons. And again, I come back to one of the things also I've heard from all speakers. There is nothing that opposes data protection, fundamental rights, and the fight against cybercrime. On the contrary, I think it is mutually reinforcing, provided, of course, we lift regularly the challenge, that the new and modernized framework for privacy poses on us. I think there is nothing inherently different in cybercrime. We are still in a world where, in order to get access, you need to have a proper authorization. So before searching a house, you need a warrant. And we need a warrant as well. We need an overall framework that imposes a warrant to be provided before actually getting electronic information. But this needs to be feasible. So there should not be additional impediments like conflict of jurisdictions, like technology on encryption, etc., that goes in the way of that. So on all these, I mean, the court's judgment on the privacy shield is one of those also challenges, because each time it refines really the interpretation of the degree of protection that data needs to be conferred to before they are transferred out of our jurisdiction. It's been the same with the opinion on passenger name records flow towards Canada. It is also the same with a very important judgment on the capacity to actually keep data, to keep data on hold in case of an investigation or a judiciary. We haven't completed the response 100%, but each time I think this puts on us, the owners, the responsibility to be better in finding safeguards that actually accommodate the protection of the individuals, and really focus on what is strictly necessary in terms of the type of data that are needed, and also the proportionality. So not have a massive flow of data when you're actually looking at 2 or 3 sets of data in order to find the location of an individual or the actual attributes of that person. So all this very, very strained challenge on our side, but we should stop really opposing those principles of privacy and also fighting cybercrime. And this is also one of the reasons we do not have that much trust in the UN framework at the beginning for an overall convention, not because of the UN, but simply because the starting point of different parties is extremely different. And I think both Michael and Alexander characterized it very well. For some, the state has a duty to actually get all the data, whatever circumstances exist. This is not at all our conception of things. And this is why we need, in the framework of the Council of Europe, with countries that go well beyond Europe, fortunately, to show and make the demonstration that we're capable all together to set up framework that reinforces fundamental rights and at the same time provide the assurance to get actually the right cooperation and the right data access in order to fight crime.
Thank you, Olivier. And I think, the privacy shield has raised a lot of eyebrows, the decision. So it's important to really clarify also the circumstances and the implications. Quickly to Michael, if you have any thoughts on the other questions that we touched upon, the IoT as well as the attribution, I think are the two ones that we still would like to have an answer. And I'll also ask the same of Alexander and Albert following, as well as the point about disinformation.
Sure. So, I mean, I would say that, on the attribution question, attribution is hard, but it's not impossible. And if you actually combine resources from the private sector and from governments, and again, following the legal frameworks that we've all been spending time on here, you can actually eventually arrive at pretty good attribution. The question is just then making that leap to the actual individuals. And that is where it's critical for the connection between the private sector and law enforcement to happen. So that those are some challenges there, but generally the cyber criminals don't have the same kind of tools and capabilities that national security agencies have to obscure and obfuscate what they're doing. I think in terms of the IoT devices, I think again here this is a combination of really looking at how IoT devices are produced and the incentives for producers, and we really need to start baking cybersecurity in from the beginning and incentivizing producers to build that cybersecurity into those devices from the very start. That's really the only way we're going to deal with the IoT threat. And then I'll just throw in my view on disinformation is that this is going to be with us for a long time, and it's going to require developing some new skills among our populace, but we have some precedents for doing that, particularly if you look at the way that we deal with advertising. I guarantee you if you asked any American out there, is everything that you see in an advertisement true? There's not an American who would say, oh yeah, sure, all of that's true. Everybody looks at advertising with some degree of skepticism, and we're going to have to start building that same mindset and bringing that same skepticism to bear in more of the information space, unfortunately.
Thank you, Michael. And actually, you're putting me out of a difficult position because I got two more questions that I think are more fitting to Alexander and Albert. So in the final 2 minutes, before I thank you all, maybe let me try to pull this in. A question from Iranian academic Mokaberi. The best way to combat cybercrime is prevention by reforming the internet infrastructure, architecture to solve anonymity problems and regulating the deep web. Until when should we wait? That's the one point. And the other one, I think it's quite fitting for Albert. In new countries adopting the Budapest Convention, could you indicate what % of the country's capacity should be placed on developing the electronic evidence legislation? So I leave it to you to in the last couple of minutes to give us your feedback. Albert, do you want to take the second one?
Absolutely. That is specifically to Ghana. So Nayia, thank you. I'll comment on that briefly. Yes, our own in-country situational analysis, there is a need to reform the Evidence Act, which was passed before computers were born. So that was actually one of the initiatives that is anticipated to be done as part of the revision of Ghana's national cybersecurity strategy. However, in the wisdom of our drafters, every legislation that we have that borders on cybercrime, there are clear provisions with respect to the admissibility of digital evidence as far as certain conditions are respected: the integrity, the necessity, proportionality, the authenticity of evidence. These are the usual criminal justice requirements. And I think fairly enough, Ghana has a record of our court accepting digital evidence. It's a question of capacity in terms of training more judges, in terms of the operationalization of the existing acts, the prosecutors, but also investigators. Thank you.
Thank you, Albert. Alexander, maybe some thoughts on the reform of the internet architecture to solve anonymity issues in the web?
I don't have an answer to that, but I would like to make in half a minute 3-4 comments on some of the other points. Still on the privacy shield decision. I'm concerned about a dangerous dynamic that may come here again, that we've also seen after the Snowden revelations and other situations, namely that because of access by national security bodies to private information, there are court decisions, there is a public debate about it, and the result is higher thresholds and more obligations for criminal justice authorities, with the result being less capacities for criminal justice authorities. We don't see necessarily as a result of such decisions more limitations for national security bodies. So this is a very dangerous dynamic, and I hope it doesn't happen now after the privacy shield discussion, that there will be more requirements for criminal justice and nothing happens for national security bodies. On the question of whether there's more or less cooperation because of COVID-19, it's a strange thing. In many ways, we have more cooperation now because people make more use of virtual means to communicate, like in this event today. I'm sure there are more participants now today in the Cyber Forum than there were in the past when it was purely physical. And the same we see everywhere. We have much more cooperation with different organizations around the world because people are at home, they are bored, they want to communicate with somebody. And if you're there, they cooperate with us. On attribution, this is exactly what the provisions on WHOIS and direct cooperation to obtain subscriber information in the future protocol are about. So the future protocol should provide a clearer legal basis for attribution and facilitate the work of law enforcement on that. And on this information, I tend to agree with Michael. We have to be careful that we don't start to criminalize something which then leads to restrictions of the freedom of expression. We need much more a detailed and much more subtle debate on that, and not immediately say now we have to criminalize each and everything, because not just publicity, but many election campaigns would then become completely illegal. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander. And on that note, actually, I would thank you all individually for all your efforts in the very different realms you're working on. I want to publicly declare my failure as a moderator, as we're 15 minutes over time, but it was too good a discussion to stop it. And I would say key points that I think everyone should keep from this is we cannot have good privacy, good public safety without good cybersecurity and security overall, and that should be also part of our thinking, not to fall into that indeed dynamic where we see more power shifting to national security instead of having enough of the capacity for the criminal justice and the effectiveness based on legal certainty and safeguards. So allow me to wholeheartedly thank you for taking the time. I think it was a very interesting discussion for all our audience, and over back to the studio in Brussels.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Nayia.
Good.